On my wedding day, the priest asked if I would take him as my husband. My fiancé gripped my hand, smirking, while my daughter-in-law sat in the front row, his secret lover. Everyone expected me to say yes. Instead, I took the mic, exposed their lies, and watched police drag him away in handcuffs. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The priest's voice echoed through the crowded church, his words ringing with authority as he reached the moment that was supposed to seal my fate. Do you, Evelyn, take Richard to be your lawfully wedded husband? Every gaze in that sanctuary felt like a burning spotlight. The ivory silk of my gown clung to me, heavy with expectation. My hands trembled, not from nerves, but from the fire of something else entirely. Without hesitation, I reached for the microphone in Father Harris's hand. My voice rang steady, deliberate. Actually, I have something to share with everyone first. Gasps rippled through the pews. That moment, poised at the altar, would mark the most important turning point of my life. But before anyone could understand why, they needed to know where this story began. 6 months earlier, I was wandering through the Meridian Art Gallery downtown, pretending to appreciate modern art that looked suspiciously like someone had sneezed paint onto canvas. I was 63 years old, widowed for 15 years, and alone again, saved on a Saturday afternoon. I studied a chaotic Jackson Pollock reproduction, trying to pretend I belonged there, when I heard a smooth baritone at my shoulder. "Excuse me, but you have exquisite taste." I turned and found myself facing a silver-haired man in a tailored suit. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, eyes the color of aged whiskey, posture confident yet inviting. He looked like he belonged in expensive galleries, not me. "Well, that's debatable," I replied, keeping my gaze steady. "I was just thinking this Pollock looks like my kitchen after I tried making spaghetti sauce." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that drew people nearby to glance in our direction. "I'm Richard Hayes," he said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Evelyn Carter." That afternoon turned into an hour of conversation about art, about loss, about the cruelty of time moving forward when the heart stubbornly refuses to follow. He told me he too was a widower. No children. His wife had died of cancer 2 years earlier. His words carried a practiced vulnerability, each sentence calibrated to strike the deepest chords of empathy. "The hardest part isn't the grief," Richard said as we drifted toward the gallery exit. "It's the loneliness, learning to live as half of what you once were." God, he was good. Every phrase seemed designed to echo my own hidden thoughts. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" he asked, with just the right measure of hopefulness. I should have said no. Men like him don't appear out of nowhere with perfect timing and perfect words. But it had been so long since anyone had looked at me like I mattered, and the hunger to feel alive again won. I'd like that very much. 3 weeks later, we were dining together almost every night. He brought flowers and wine, charmed my neighbors with effortless conversation, and filled my quiet house with warmth. 2 months later, he was sleeping over most weekends, making me breakfast in my kitchen while the coffee brewed. "You make me feel young again," he whispered one morning, brushing my cheek with lips that carried promises I wanted so desperately to believe. By the 4th month, he was kneeling in my rose garden, the very one my late husband Thomas had planted for our 20th anniversary. Richard held out a ring so dazzling it sparkled brighter than the midday sun. "Evelyn," he said, voice low and earnest, "we haven't known each other long. But why waste time pretending we have forever? I want to spend every year I have left making you happy." The ring gleamed, flawless and perfect. He was flawless and perfect. And like a foolish girl instead of a cautious widow, I said yes. He insisted on a proper wedding. "You deserve to walk down that aisle like the queen you are." His words lit a flame inside me, and for the first time in years, I dared to dream about a second chance at happiness. We planned for 6 months. 300 guests, live music, flowers everywhere. Every detail seemed to weave itself into a fairy tale. I should have seen the cracks, the shadows lurking behind his polished charm. But I didn't. I let myself believe in the story he painted, let myself imagine a future where I wasn't simply a woman who had survived loneliness, but one who had conquered. Added, if only I'd known that my Prince Charming was no prince at all. He was the wolf dressed in silk, waiting patiently at the altar. What he didn't know, standing beside me in that church, was that this story wasn't going to end with me as his prey. No, it was going to end with me as the one doing the hunting. The morning after Richard proposed, I picked up the phone with trembling hands and called my son. "You're getting married?" Andrew's voice shot up so high I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Mom, that's incredible. When do I get to meet him properly?" "This weekend," I said, smiling despite the nerves that twisted inside me. "I'm cooking Sunday dinner for all of you." By Saturday evening, Richard arrived at my door with expensive wine in hand, his smile polished to perfection. Minutes later, Andrew and Julia came carrying flowers, their eyes alive with curiosity about the mysterious man who had captured my heart. From the kitchen, I watched as Richard worked his charm on my family. He had this uncanny way of making everyone feel like the center of the universe, as if each word he spoke was tailored specifically for them. "So, Richard, what do you do?" Andrew asked, settling onto the couch with a beer in hand. "Investment consulting," Richard replied smoothly. "I help people like your mother manage their portfolios, protect their assets. The wealthy need guidance on how to make their money work for them." Wealthy? The word made me pause. I had Thomas's life insurance policy and my pension from years of teaching, but I wasn't exactly dripping in diamonds. "That's perfect," Julia chimed in, leaning forward with eager interest. "Evelyn definitely needs someone to look out for her finances." Something in her tone made my grip tighten around the serving spoon. It was as though she saw me as some fragile old woman who couldn't balance her own checkbook. "I've managed just fine for 15 years, I called from the kitchen. "Of course you have, sweetheart," Richard replied quickly. "But wouldn't it be nice to have professional help?" His words were coated in sugar, but they stung. I carried the roast into the dining room, refusing to let him see how they landed. Throughout dinner, small details gnawed at me. Julia's subtle glances when she thought no one noticed. Richard's lingering touch as he passed her the salt. The way their laughter seemed to belong to a private world I couldn't enter. "So, when's the big day?" Julia asked, sawing into her steak with unnecessary force. "October 15th, I said softly. "Nothing too elaborate." "Nonsense," Richard interrupted, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "A woman like Evelyn deserves the wedding of her dreams. Big church, beautiful reception, the works." Andrew raised his glass. "To new beginnings and second chances." We toasted, but unease settled in my chest like a stone. Richard kept sneaking glances at his phone under the table, and Julia seemed more interested in studying him than celebrating with me. Later, after Andrew and Julia left, Richard stayed to help me clean. His arms wrapped around me from behind as I rinsed dishes. "Your family is wonderful," he whispered against my hair. "They are. Andrew is a good man, and Julia, she's protective of him." "Sometimes a little too protective if you ask me," Richard murmured. "But nothing's wrong with looking out for family." That night, his phone buzzed constantly, a relentless stream of messages. "Popular guy," I teased, trying to sound light. "Client emergency," he explained, silencing the device. "Money never sleeps, darling." I wanted to believe him. I forced myself to believe him. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into wedding planning with a kind of giddy desperation I hadn't felt in decades. 300 guests, a live band, flowers in every corner. Richard insisted on paying for nearly everything. "I can afford my own wedding," I protested one afternoon at a cake tasting. "I know you can, sweetheart," he said, stroking my hand. "But let me do this for you. Let me spoil you." It sounded romantic, yet deep down, something twisted in me. Love was supposed to bring comfort, not unease. Meanwhile, Julia began showing up at my house more often. She'd arrive with stacks of wedding magazines, casseroles she claimed I needed, or simply an excuse to help. But her questions were never about me. "Where's Richard today?" she'd ask casually, her eyes roaming the house like she expected him to step out of the shadows. "Business meeting?" I'd answer, studying her expression. "He works so hard. You're lucky to have someone so dedicated." The way she said dedicated made something cold crawl across my skin. One evening, Julia arrived just as Richard was leaving for another late dinner. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the air thickened. "Oh," Julia said, cheeks flushing pink. "I didn't know you were here." Just picking up some documents, Richard replied smoothly. But the look that passed between them made my stomach twist into knots. Have a lovely evening, Julia said softly, watching him walk to his car. That night, I stood alone in my kitchen, glass of wine in hand, staring at my engagement ring. The diamond caught the light and sprayed tiny rainbows across the cabinets, but all I could think was how something so beautiful shouldn't feel so complicated. Love was messy, I told myself. Second chances didn't come with instruction manuals. Surely this unease was just nerves, the natural jitters of a bride-to-be at 63. At least that's what I kept telling myself as the shadows around Richard and Julia lengthened and the silence between my instincts and my trust grew harder to ignore. When a man's phone rings more often than a telemarketer's during dinner, it isn't success, it's a warning. Richard's phone buzzed at the oddest hours, late at night, early mornings, even during Sunday breakfast when the world should have been quiet. Every time, he'd step outside, murmuring into the receiver, returning with vague excuses about clients overseas or emergencies that couldn't wait. The investment world never sleeps, he'd say, kissing my forehead as if that affection could erase suspicion. Once we're married, I'll scale back. You will have my undivided attention. It was meant to reassure me, but it did the opposite. Romance wasn't supposed to be scheduled between business calls. Then came the texts. His phone buzzed constantly, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through conversations like a warning bell. He'd glance at the screen, his expression shifting in ways he tried to hide, then slip the phone back into his pocket without responding. Everything okay? I asked one morning as he stirred sugar into his coffee. Spam, he replied casually. Minutes later, I caught him typing furiously under the table, his thumbs moving with desperate speed. The moment that truly unraveled my fragile trust came on an ordinary afternoon. My car had died in his driveway, and with my phone charging upstairs, I reached for his. As I dialed for roadside assistance, a message appeared across the screen. L, missing you already. My blood turned cold. When Richard returned with jumper cables, I held up the phone. Who's L? For the briefest second, his face lost its practiced composure. Then he chuckled. Oh, that's Larry, my business partner. He gets sentimental after a few drinks. Larry, right, because business partners always confess they miss each other like star-crossed lovers. That was the first crack I couldn't ignore. From that day forward, I paid attention, really paid attention. Richard disappeared on errands that lasted hours, returning with the wrong groceries or nothing at all. His stories about his late wife shifted constantly. Cancer one day, a car accident the next, then suddenly a hiking tragedy in Colorado. Your wife was quite the adventurer, I remarked one evening. What do you mean? He asked too quickly. Well, yesterday you said she died hiking in Colorado. Last week it was cancer. He smiled smoothly, never missing a beat. Different wives, sweetheart. I told you I was married twice before. No, he hadn't. But I swallowed my questions and filed away the inconsistency like a librarian shelving a dangerous book. Julia's presence grew heavier too. She arrived unannounced with casseroles, bridal magazines, or flimsy excuses about helping. She asked about Richard's schedule with casual interest that felt anything but casual. Where's your handsome fiancé today? She'd ask, glancing around my house like a detective searching for clues. Business meeting in Atlanta, I'd answer, watching her carefully. Must be lonely, with him traveling so much. She'd say softly, her smile just sharp enough to cut. One evening, Andrew and Julia joined us for dinner. Richard arrived late, claiming traffic had delayed him after a client emergency. When he finally walked in, Julia nearly glowed. Richard, we were starting to worry, she said, rushing to embrace him. The hug lasted 3 seconds too long. I counted. Crisis averted, Richard announced, his hand brushing the small of her back as if he owned it. Andrew, oblivious, poured wine and launched into stories about his engineering projects. But I saw everything. The way Julia's breath caught when Richard touched her. The secret smile they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. Later, I excused myself to fetch dessert. From the kitchen doorway, I spotted them by the window, heads close, whispering like guilty teenagers. Everything all right? I asked loudly. They jumped apart. Julia's cheeks flushed. Just asking Richard about that new restaurant downtown. Thought Andrew and I might try it. Wonderful recommendation, Richard added smoothly, his voice carrying no trace of guilt. That night, after they left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat alone with the silence. The engagement ring on my finger sparkled under the kitchen light, but it felt heavier than ever, like a shackle I'd locked on myself. The next morning, fate handed me what I'd been afraid to see. While Richard showered, I picked up his phone. 1947, his birth year, was the passcode. Men never change their passwords. They simply recycle numbers that matter. I scrolled. Months of intimate messages between Richard and Elle. Photographs I couldn't bear to look at. Julia's words describing my daily routines, my financial situation, even the times I went to bed. She's usually asleep by 10, she'd written. Perfect, Richard had replied. But the worst was a message from last week. 2 more weeks and we're home free. The old lady trusts me completely. Julia's response? I still feel guilty sometimes. Richard's reply? Don't. She's had 63 years of happiness. Now it's our turn. I closed the phone, my hands trembling, my chest tight with fury and disbelief. For a long moment, I stared at my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. I didn't see a naive widow anymore. I saw something sharper, colder, stronger. I slipped the phone back exactly where I'd found it and returned to bed. When Richard stepped out of the bathroom, freshly shaved and smiling, he found me already curled beneath the sheets, eyes heavy with feigned sleep. Come here, beautiful, he whispered, sliding beside me. I let him hold me. Let him whisper his sugary lies about our future. Let him believe he'd fooled me. But inside, my heart had shifted. No longer his prey, I was already planning the hunt. Sleep became impossible. My body lay still beneath the blankets, but my mind raged with every lie I had swallowed and every smile Richard had rehearsed. The man I thought I would marry wasn't a widower searching for healing. He was a predator circling his latest meal. At 2 in the morning, I sat alone in my kitchen with a pot of coffee and my laptop, the glow of the screen carving shadows across the walls. I began digging into Richard Hayes' past with the precision of someone who had spent 3 decades as a librarian. People think librarians are gentle creatures, but we are hunters too. We know how to chase information until it surrenders. Richard's digital footprint was strangely clean. No Facebook, no LinkedIn, no trace of the successful investment consultant he claimed to be. But I kept pushing. In the archives of the Tampa Bay Times, I found his face staring back at me. The article headline chilled me. Investment advisor vanishes after fraud allegations. The man in the photograph looked younger, cockier, but unmistakably Richard. The story detailed how he had defrauded elderly clients of their savings, then disappeared when investigators closed in. My coffee went cold in my hands. My stomach turned as I read about forged documents, phantom accounts, and widows left destitute. Richard Hayes was no grieving widower. He was a seasoned thief. I pressed deeper, pulling court records, marriage licenses, and bankruptcy filings. His trail stretched across states: Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. Every time, the same pattern: women over 60, whirlwind romance, financial entanglement, then disaster. There were even restraining orders, written in the shaking hands of women who had once thought they'd found love. Son of a bitch, I whispered, staring at the evidence scattered across my kitchen table. Still, one question burned hotter than the rest. Where did Julia fit into this nightmare? Victim or accomplice? That afternoon, I found out. Julia left Andrew's office during her lunch break. I followed, heart pounding like a drum line, the steering wheel slick beneath my palms. She drove straight to the downtown Marriott, the same hotel Richard had supposedly visited for business lunches. She pulled a key card from her purse and disappeared into the elevator. I waited 2 agonizing hours in the lobby. When Julia finally reappeared, her hair was mussed, her lipstick gone. 5 minutes later, Richard emerged, adjusting his tie with the smugness of a man who thought the world was his stage. My heart cracked and it hardened all at once. That evening, he arrived at my house with Thai takeout and lilies, kissing my cheek as if he hadn't spent his afternoon in a hotel bed with my daughter-in-law. You seem quiet tonight, he observed, unpacking cartons of noodles. Just tired. Wedding planning is exhausting. I smiled sweetly, playing my part. In 2 weeks, we'll be on our honeymoon in Maui. Just you, me, and the ocean. He kissed the top of my head. I nodded, but behind my smile, the storm had settled into clarity. After dinner, I poured wine while he showered. I spread the papers I had printed, his fraud, his aliases, his failed marriages, across my dining room table like tarot cards predicting doom. Every fact told the same story. Richard Hayes wasn't just a liar. He was a professional con artist, and Julia was his willing partner. When he emerged, hair damp, smelling of my soap, he found me in my nightgown, pretending to be drowsy and content. "Come here, beautiful," he said, sliding beside me. His hands rested possessively on my waist, as if I already belonged to him. I let him think I did. But the truth had become my weapon. Every kiss, every whispered promise, every touch he believed was victory was only fuel for the trap I was setting. The next morning, I called Catherine Doyle, my lawyer and trusted friend. "How are the wedding plans, Evelyn?" she asked warmly. "Interesting," I replied, my voice calm. "I need advice about protecting my assets." "From what?" "From a wolf wearing Prince Charming's clothing." Silence stretched, then Catherine said carefully, "Tell me everything." By noon, her conference table was covered in evidence. She flipped through the documents, her lips pressed into a hard line. "Good God, Evelyn, this man is a career criminal." "I know," I said evenly. "The question isn't whether I leave him. The question is how I end him." Catherine studied me for a long moment. "Most women in your position would cancel the wedding and disappear. You're planning something else. I want to make sure he never does this to another woman, and I want Julia to face the consequences of betraying my son. He thinks he's walking into a payday. I'm going to give him a reckoning." Her eyes narrowed. "Then we'll need strategy, asset protection, legal traps, airtight documentation. If you're serious, we can bury him." "I'm beyond serious." That night, Richard returned with champagne, full of laughter, eager to celebrate being so close to our new life together. I raised my glass and smiled like the fool he thought I was. "Our wedding will be unforgettable," he promised. "You have no idea," I whispered into the rim of my glass, tasting both bubbles and vengeance. I wasn't just calling off a wedding. I was preparing an execution. Not of flesh and blood, but of illusions, of lies, of the empire Richard had built on charm and deceit. Every morning I woke with a clearer sense of purpose. While he slipped out for meetings, I worked quietly behind the scenes, laying out each step of the destruction that awaited him. Catherine Doyle drafted airtight documents to freeze my accounts the moment I gave the word. I wouldn't allow him access to a single cent. She arranged legal protections that would activate after the ceremony, ensuring he'd walk into a cage of consequences he couldn't charm his way out of. But legal armor wasn't enough. I needed witnesses. Proof, a spectacle that would burn his reputation and expose Julia's betrayal in front of everyone who mattered. I spent long nights on the phone, reaching out to the women I'd discovered in my research, his former victims. Helen Brooks from Tampa answered on the first ring. "He made me feel like a queen," she said bitterly. "Then he stole everything." "Would you testify against him?" I asked. "With what evidence? He left nothing behind." "I have evidence," I told her, "enough to bury him. I just need you to be there." The silence stretched before she whispered, "Tell me where and when." By the end of the week, I had commitments from 4 women, each scarred by Richard's con, each carrying the kind of truth he could never erase. They would travel to Georgia for my wedding, not to watch me pledge my life to him, but to witness his empire collapse. In the quiet hours, I practiced my speech. Standing before my bathroom mirror in my nightgown, I rehearsed the words I would speak when Father Harris asked me to vow myself to Richard. "Actually, there's something you all need to know." I repeated it until the mirror reflected not just a widow in ivory silk, but an avenging angel sharpening her blade of truth. Meanwhile, I played the part of the blushing bride flawlessly. I laughed at Richard's jokes, clung to his arm during cake tastings, and feigned joy as we discussed honeymoon plans. Every "I love you" I whispered was laced with venom he couldn't taste. One evening, as we sat on my porch swing watching the sunset, Richard kissed my temple and murmured, "10 more days, Evelyn. I can hardly wait to make you my wife." "Our wedding will be unforgettable," I answered softly, and for once I spoke nothing but the truth. The closer we drew to the ceremony, the more brazen Julia became. She arrived at my house carrying lemon cookies, her face carefully arranged into innocence. "I thought you might be stressed," she said, settling onto my sofa as though she lived there. "Just wanted to check in." "How thoughtful," I replied sweetly, watching her squirm. "Are you excited?" she asked. "Of course, after all these years, I finally deserve a man who is honest and faithful." Her smile faltered. "Richard loves you." "Does he?" I tilted my head. "Because lately I get the feeling there are things about him I don't know." Julia's cheeks drained of color. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just little things. Phone calls at odd hours, meetings that run longer than they should. You haven't noticed anything strange, have you?" "No," she said too quickly. "Nothing strange at all." "Good," I answered, letting silence hang heavy, because I'd hate to think someone close to me was keeping secrets. When she left, my hands shook, not from fear, but from the effort it took to restrain myself from revealing what I already knew. Richard arrived later that evening, his arms full of champagne and roses, glowing with anticipation. "We're almost there, sweetheart. In 10 days, you'll be mine forever." I kissed him, smiled at him, and let him believe it. But inside, I was counting down the days, not to a honeymoon, but to his reckoning. The church was filled with 300 guests, their chatter and laughter rising toward the vaulted ceiling like restless birds. Stained glass windows cast colors across polished pews, bathing everything in false serenity. I walked down the aisle alone, my ivory gown trailing behind me like a whisper of the life I was about to bury. Richard stood at the altar, flawless in his tuxedo, smiling with the confidence of a man convinced the world adored him. His eyes softened when he saw me, but behind that gaze lurked the smug assurance of victory. "You look radiant," he whispered as I reached his side. "Thank you," I said, my voice smooth, betraying nothing of the storm beneath my ribs. Father Harris began the ceremony, his voice steady and solemn. Vows were recited, prayers lifted, rings blessed. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, but my mind was fixed on what was coming. "And now," Father Harris declared, "do you, Evelyn Carter, take Richard Hayes to be your lawfully wedded husband." The sanctuary stilled. The only sound was the rustle of skirts and the faint hum of the organ pipes. Richard squeezed my hand, his smile broadening. I looked into his eyes, lifted the microphone, and let my voice cut through the silence. "Actually, I have something to share before I answer." A ripple of gasps surged through the congregation. Cameras lifted, phones poised, every guest suddenly aware that something unforgettable was unfolding. I turned to face the crowd. Richard Hayes is not who you think he is. He is not a grieving widower seeking love. He is a con man, a thief, and a predator. Murmurs exploded into shouts, the church erupting in shock. Richard's smile faltered, his grip on my hand tightening. "Darling, what are you—" "Don't!" I snapped, my voice ringing like steel. "I have the proof, court records, testimonies, bank statements. He has married women like me in 3 states, drained their accounts, and vanished. He thought I would be his next victim." I pulled a stack of papers from beneath the lectern, my hands steady as I raised them high. "But I am not his victim. Not today." Gasps turned into whispers, whispers into a roar. Guests leaned forward, phones recording. The sanctuary transformed into a courtroom. "And he didn't do it alone," I continued, my gaze landing on Julia. "My daughter-in-law stood beside him. She fed him information, betrayed my son, and planned to help him steal everything I had." Julia's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "That's not true," she stammered. "It's very true," I said coldly. "I read your messages. I know every secret meeting, every lie you whispered when you thought no one was listening." The congregation erupted again, shocked voices overlapping as Andrew stood frozen, staring at his wife with disbelief etched across his face. Richard tried to laugh it off, raising his hands. "This is absurd. Evelyn, you're tired, confused." "Confused?" I hissed, my voice echoing off stone walls. "No, Richard, I've never seen more clearly. You are finished." At my signal, Detective Ramirez rose from the back pew. He stepped forward, badge flashing under the stained glass light. "Richard Hayes, you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy." The sanctuary fell into stunned silence as officers moved swiftly, surrounding Richard. His mask cracked at last, rage twisting his features as he turned to me. "You bitch!" he spat, his voice stripped of charm. I lifted my chin, unflinching. "No, Richard, I'm the woman who ended you." Handcuffs clicked, sharp and final. Julia screamed as officers restrained her too, Andrew's devastation splitting the air like a wound no words could heal. Guests gasped, cameras flashing, the spectacle captured from every angle. As Richard was dragged down the aisle, shouting threats, I turned back to the congregation. My voice steadied, carrying over the chaos. "This wasn't the wedding you expected," I said, "but it's exactly the one I planned." Silence followed, heavy and reverent, before applause broke out, hesitant at first, then thunderous, filling the church with the sound of vindication. I laid the microphone back on the lectern, lifted my skirt, and walked down the aisle alone. My gown no longer felt heavy. It felt like armor, gleaming in the fractured light of stained glass as I stepped into a future I had chosen, not as someone's prey, but as my own protector. By the next morning, my wedding wasn't just a scandal, it was a movement. The video of me standing at the altar, voice steady as I exposed Richard and Julia, spread faster than wildfire. Clips flooded social media, hashtags trended worldwide, and by dawn, strangers across the globe knew my name. Some called me brave, others called me ruthless, but all of them called me unforgettable. I sat at my kitchen table, still in the satin robe from the night before, scrolling through endless headlines. Widow outs con man at altar. Bride turns wedding into sting operation. Don't mess with Evelyn Carter. The irony almost made me laugh. I hadn't planned to become a symbol. I'd only planned to survive. Yet here I was, my voice reaching further than I ever imagined. The FBI contacted me within 24 hours. 2 agents arrived in press suits, carrying thick folders filled with Richard's history. "Your public statement gave us leverage," Agent Collins explained. "We've been after Hayes for years, but victims rarely speak out. They're too ashamed." "Not anymore," I said firmly. "He thrived because women like me stayed silent. That silence is canceled." The agents exchanged a look, then slid photographs across my table. Victims, dozens of them. Their faces mirrored my own grief, my own fury. One picture stopped me cold. Helen Brooks, the woman who had answered my call weeks ago. Her eyes looked hollow in the photo, but when she later sat in my living room, they sparked again with fire. "You gave me back my voice," she told me, gripping my hands. "I thought I'd die with this shame buried inside me. But you showed the world who he is. You made me believe I can fight again." Her words planted a seed. I realized my revenge wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about every woman who had been tricked, humiliated, and left broken by predators who wore love as a mask. Andrew sat across from me, his face drawn with grief. Julia's betrayal had goaded him, leaving scars that no mother's love could heal. He hadn't spoken much since the arrest, but that night he finally looked at me with wet eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "how did you stay so strong?" "Because I had to," I said softly. "But strength doesn't mean I didn't hurt. It just means I refused to let the hurt define me." His voice cracked. "I should have seen what Julia was doing. I should have protected you." "You couldn't have known," I told him firmly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "She fooled us both. But we're not victims anymore. We're survivors." When news crews camped outside my house, asking for interviews, I realized I had a choice. Retreat back into quiet anonymity, or use this spotlight to burn away the shadows where men like Richard thrived. I chose the fire. The first time I stood before cameras, I didn't feel fear. I felt purpose. My voice carried steadiness, my message unwavering. If you've been conned, shamed, or silenced, you are not alone. Speak up, share your story, because silence only helps predators. And I promise you, silence ends today. Messages poured in from women across the country, emails, letters, phone calls. Some had lost money, others dignity, and many both. But all of them shared the same ache, the same loneliness that predators had exploited. We gathered in community halls and living rooms, our stories weaving together into something powerful. We called ourselves the Widow Warriors. Not because all of us were widows, but because we were fighters who had buried not just husbands, but illusions, shame, and fear. Each meeting began with tears, but ended with strength. Women embraced, shared resources, and offered testimonies to law enforcement. One by one, predators who thought they were untouchable found themselves exposed. Through it all, I felt my life transforming. The loneliness that had once driven me into Richard's arms now drove me into the arms of sisters who understood my scars. I was no longer a woman who had almost been destroyed at the altar. I was the woman who had built an army from her own ashes. And as our group grew, so did my conviction. This was no longer about Richard. He was already rotting in a cell, stripped of his charm and power. No, this was about the next Richard and the one after that. This was about standing at the gates where predators hunted and slamming them shut. For the first time in decades, I felt alive, not because of love, but because of purpose. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever been lied to, used, or betrayed, know this: you are not broken. You are not weak. And if my story proves anything, it's that revenge can be more than justice. It can be rebirth. Like, share, tell your story, join us. Because together we are unstoppable. The weeks after Richard's arrest felt like stepping into a world I had never known existed. My name had become a rallying cry, and women from every corner of the country reached out. At first, it was overwhelming. The phone never stopped ringing. Letters arrived in stacks, and my email filled faster than I could open it. Yet behind every message was the same heartbeat: pain, loss, and the desperate need to be heard. The Widow Warriors began in my living room with just a handful of women. Helen Brooks sat on one end of my sofa, her voice shaking as she told her story. Another woman, Caroline, described how her con-man husband drained her retirement fund and vanished. One by one, we shared our wounds, and the room became a cathedral of survival. I remember looking around and realizing that something extraordinary was taking root. These women were no longer silent. They were warriors. Soon the gatherings grew too large for my home. We rented community halls, church basements, and eventually, hotel ballrooms. Word spread like a beacon, drawing in not only widows but divorced women, single mothers, and even men who had been swindled. We were building more than a group. We were building a movement. Law enforcement began attending our meetings. Detective Ramirez stood before one gathering, his badge gleaming under fluorescent lights, and said, "Your courage makes our job possible. Without voices like yours, predators vanish into shadows. Keep speaking. We'll keep listening." We partnered with lawyers who offered pro bono services, financial experts who taught how to guard assets, and therapists who soothed the invisible scars scams had left behind. Step by step, we created a fortress where women could find safety and strength. Richard's trial became the centerpiece of our work. For weeks, I sat in the courtroom watching him in his prison uniform, stripped of his designer suits and arrogant smile. He tried at first to charm the jury, speaking with that same honeyed tone that had once deceived me, but it didn't work. The evidence was undeniable, the testimonies damning. Helen stood on the witness stand, her voice steady as she said, "He stole my money, but he won't steal my dignity." When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, an electric hush filled the room before cheers erupted. Richard Hayes was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Julia, tried separately for her role, received 3 years. I sat behind Andrew as the sentence was read, my son's shoulders squared with both grief and relief. His life had been torn apart, yet I could see him beginning to rebuild, brick by brick. After the trial, the Widow Warriors gained even more traction. News outlets covered our story, donations poured in, and suddenly we had the means to expand nationwide. We established chapters in multiple states, each led by women who had once been victims but now stood as leaders. Our motto was simple but powerful: we fight back. For me, the transformation was deeply personal. I no longer woke to the ache of loneliness or the memory of Thomas's absence. Instead, I woke with purpose. I had become a guardian, not just for myself, but for countless others. Andrew eventually found his own healing. A year after Julia's sentencing, he introduced me to a woman named Claire. She was gentle but strong, her kindness unforced. I saw the way she looked at him, with honesty, with tenderness, and I knew he had finally found someone worthy of his heart. Watching him begin again reminded me that life, even scarred, could still bloom. One evening after a national conference where hundreds of women had gathered, I stood at the podium and gazed out at the sea of faces. Survivors, warriors, sisters. Their applause thundered like waves crashing against stone, and I felt Thomas with me in that moment, not as a ghost of the past, but as a reminder that love comes in many forms. The love I had once yearned for in Richard's arms, I now found in the unity of these women. Richard may have thought he could break me, but in truth he built me into something indestructible. The widow warriors were proof of that. We weren't just preventing scams, we were rewriting stories. We were turning shame into strength, silence into a chorus that refused to be ignored. And as I stepped down from the stage that night, women pressed into me with tears in their eyes, hugging me, thanking me, promising me that they too would protect others. I realized something profound. This wasn't the end of my journey. It was only the beginning. 2 years later, my life looked nothing like the quiet widowhood I once imagined for myself. The widow warriors had grown into a national force, thousands of women bound not by tragedy but by triumph. We held conferences across the country, trained volunteers to teach financial literacy, and partnered with law enforcement to hunt down predators who thought they could hide in plain sight. I stood at the center of it all, not as a victim, but as a leader. My voice carried through microphones, my face appeared on news networks, and my story reached places I never dreamed it would go. And with every retelling, another woman stepped forward, unafraid to speak her truth. Some nights, when the whirlwind of it all slowed, I would walk through my rose garden, the one where Richard had once knelt with a diamond ring and empty promises. The roses bloomed brighter now, fed not by fantasy, but by resilience. Their thorns no longer frightened me. They reminded me that beauty and strength can grow together. Andrew healed in ways I once feared he never could. He married Claire in a ceremony filled with laughter, light, and honesty. I watched him slip the ring on her finger and felt no sorrow for the past, only gratitude that he had found someone who saw him clearly and loved him for it. My heart swelled knowing that betrayal had not stolen his capacity for trust. As for Richard, he remained behind bars, stripped of the silk suits and polished lies that once cloaked him. I did not waste time wondering if he regretted what he had done. Some men do not change. Some men rot. Justice had found him, and that was enough. Julia's 3 years passed slowly, and when she was released, Andrew made it clear she was no longer welcome in his life. The door closed, and with it, the shadow of her betrayal faded. One afternoon, while traveling for a conference, I returned to the Meridian Art Gallery, the very place where this story began. The paintings hung in the same chaotic brilliance, but I walked the halls with new eyes. I remembered the moment Richard approached me, his charm a velvet blade pressed against my loneliness. But the sting was gone. No man could ever wield my solitude against me again. A younger woman paused beside me, gazing uncertainly at a Pollock piece. "Do you think this is beautiful?" she asked. I smiled, my voice warm. "Beauty isn't always what others tell you it is. Sometimes it's what you decide to survive." She looked at me, puzzled, but I simply nodded and walked on. At the closing banquet of our National Widow Warriors Conference, I stood before a ballroom filled with women whose lives had been changed by the movement. The applause roared, their voices rising with chants of solidarity, and I felt something I once thought I had lost forever. Joy. Not the fleeting joy of romance, but the lasting joy of purpose. I lifted the microphone, my voice carrying over the thunder of their unity. Some fairy tales end with happily ever after, mine did not. But what I gained is far greater than a prince or a promise. I found power, I found purpose, and I found all of you. Together we are not prey, together we are warriors. The crowd rose to their feet, their cheers shaking the walls, and I knew then that this was the life I had been meant to live. No longer defined by loneliness, no longer deceived by false promises, I was free. And in that freedom, I had built something stronger than any wedding vow, a legacy that would outlast me. Some fairy tales close with a kiss, mine close with a battle cry, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Like, share, tell your story, join us, because this is not the end. It is only the beginning.